Good evening, and what's so great about Shakespeare? How did a man who couldn't even spell his own name consistently come to have more literary clout than Homer, Virgil, Racine, Goethe and Pushkin all rolled into one? In Britain, he's more marketable than the monarchy. The face that was once a woodcut in a few folios has in our time become a logo on a million T-shirts, and now it's a hologram on a credit card. He was chosen for this honour, apparently, because he was non-political and uncontroversial. Tolstoy called Shakespeare an enemy of democracy. Shaw called Shakespeare a snob. The average schoolchild, forced at gunpoint to read Hamlet, called Shakespeare a pain in the neck. To be or not to be, who cares? Well, Kenneth Baker cares. As Secretary of State for Education, he's strong for the national curriculum and for a return to the 3 R's. Only last week he said that more English history should be taught at school, and he has said at other times that Shakespeare's plays are a bang-up way of hearing about history. He put many useful Shakespeare quotations to this effect in his Faber book of English history in verse, so it isn't hard to see why he wants Shakespeare to be taught at school, and doesn't mind too much if some of the pupils find that hard. Less confident about the automatically beneficial effects of teaching Shakespeare to school children who'd rather be watching EastEnders is Terence Hawkes, Professor of English at the University of Wales College of Cardiff. He has doubts about the Shakespeare industry and detects jingoistic brainwashing in the way we've elevated the bard to godlike status, a totem of Englishness and established power, his collected works ranking with the Bible on desert island discs. We've been caught up, Terence Hawkes thinks, in the cheer squad of what George Bernard Shaw called bardolatry. A distant relative of George Bernard Shaw is with us tonight, Fiona Shaw. Obliged to choose between the theatre and philosophy, she chose the theatre, a providential choice, because as an actress she has been getting the kind of reviews that nobody ever gave a philosopher. Of her recent portrayal of Sophocles' Electra, the Sunday Times said that she burned with private anguish and majestic, impersonal moral rage. The Sunday Times never said that about Schopenhauer. But there are only so many Greek classic roles to play. Finally, the actress in the English language who has the capacity to play greatly must turn to Shakespeare, although Fiona Shaw might say, has said, that there is only so much he wrote for women. Both the Royal Shakespeare Company and the English Shakespeare Company are about to launch performances of the history plays that will last all day. In the West End, Derek Jacobi has just opened as Richard III, a role he will alternate with Richard II. Othello and Twelfth Night were both on television over Christmas, and Kenneth Branagh will release a new film of Henry V later this year. If Shakespeare was a cult before, he's a colossus now. Terence Hawkes, is this just?
Well, I don't know. I think that I wouldn't make too much about the amount of Shakespeare that's coming out. I counted in today's paper there are 2 theatres in London out of 50, I think, that are showing Shakespeare plays. So if you'd been to the theatre tonight, you'd be one of about, 2,000 or 3,000 people. Most of the rest of the population are doing things like staying at home and watching this programme and behaving themselves in a quite different way.
You still think it's an industry, don't you? The whole tendency of
Well,
your
don't
work.
you? Isn't he an industry?
No, I don't. I've read your work with great attention. I think it's very, very delicately and indeed transparently argued for someone who has your semiotic background and so on. But I said the tendency of it is to say that Shakespeare has become a kind of business, a huge. In fact, one of the growth areas of English culture, isn't that true?
I think it's more than that. What I'm saying is that Shakespeare has become something that is used as part of an ideological processing business, so that to make people feel part of a cohesive culture. It's been used like that, I would say, since the mid-19th century. And my point, the first point I was making was simply that Shakespeare is not part of everybody's experience. If you can cite 2,000 or 3,000 people who go to the theatre to watch Shakespeare, but most of the people in Britain, the 50 million of us, aren't interested in Shakespeare. They don't have anything to do with him. They don't have anything to say about him. And they're far more interested in programmes like Coronation Street on television.
But he's still top bard. How did he get to be top playwright, even if he isn't the top entertainer in the country?
Well, you're contradicting yourself when you say that. If he isn't the top entertainer in the country, how can he be top bard?
But he is, because he's way ahead of other playwrights, isn't he? In fact, he's the playwright. He's the representative playwright of English culture.
Well, yes, but in what sense? Who says he's this? This is the question I'd ask. Who says he's this? Whose culture are we talking about?
The same people, I think, who say that Michelangelo is probably the best artist of all time. I think it's just so.
Well, I don't think things are just so. I think things appear to be just so until you look at the political and social context in which they occur.
Yes, there are reasons. I mean, there are reasons why it is so. I mean, I think there are textual reasons why it is so. You can match him text for text with anybody else. And if you deal with if you deal with the Jacobeans, you're probably dealing with a much more lower area of lust and greed and passion and hatred. And you deal with Shakespeare, and you see this man, instead of hearing the writer's mind, you hear for some prismatic reason, you hear the character's mind, each separate character.
But the characters don't have minds; they don't exist.
But they don't exist in terms, if you say that the writing on the page is just a series of hieroglyphics, they don't exist. But they exist very quickly if you start speaking them aloud, and you'll hear the rhythms of their language is quite different to each other. So they do. They have a kind of a blueprint of their brains.
No, I don't think they do. I'm sorry, they don't. Hamlet does not exist. He's not a real person. He doesn't have a mind, and thoughts don't go through his mind.
No, I fear that we're going to get stuck on what existence is, but I can give you an example about, there are two characters, say, and As You Like It, one's called Rosalind and one's called Celia. They're both friends. You think they'd be the same.
Okay, look, let's get to Rosalind in a second. I'm still intrigued with the question whether Hamlet existed or not, in what sense he could be said to exist, and if he doesn't, who does? Does Hamlet exist?
Well, of course Hamlet exists, and as any person who's created any drama or novel or work of art exists. And what I find so extraordinary is the attempt by Professor Hawkes to sort of say, well, Shakespeare is not really central. It seems to be that Shakespeare is absolutely central to not only our culture, but the culture of the world.
But how can
and
you
why,
possibly...
can I just say why I think it is so, why I think it's important for children to study it at school. Difficult as it is for them in many cases, though there are imaginative ways now of teaching Shakespeare, for a variety of reasons. First, there's the sheer imaginative genius of this man. Michelangelo, Fiona has said, on the same sort of scale, a tremendous, he's a mountain range of creation with great peaks. And there's the sunshine shining on part of the mountain range and storms on the others, and at different times of the day, different light reflects off it. And it is the imaginative genius. He's created a whole range of dramatic situations, dealing with great passions, with love and hatred,
Yes,
with jealousy and envy. Just hang on a moment. And
I've been
these
hanging
are
on
not
quite a
just,
lot,
but
actually.
these just haven't inspired just a few people. They've inspired 4 centuries, and they've inspired other great artists. It is there. It is absolutely central. The second reason why I think Shakespeare is central, and I think this is what bugs you. Yes, hang on. You have your chance. The second reason is the language and the poetry. You have not mentioned the word poetry once in what you've been saying, and yet when you come to the English language, Shakespeare is one of the developers and formers of it. In that first 25 years of the 17th century, the printing of the King James Bible in 1609 and the printing of the first folio of Shakespeare in 1623 helped to shape the English language. The Bible has a vocabulary of 9,000 words, Shakespeare of 30,000 words. He helped to shape it, and it's part of what we carry around with us.
Now, Kenneth, that was a party political broadcast on behalf of the Shakespearean
A major
party.
one, yes.
He asked you, you hadn't mentioned, he said that you hadn't mentioned the language just one at all yet, and I've got a feeling that you haven't had the chance to yet. What I want you to do is lay out your position about your political position about Shakespeare. Because when I read your work, a political position is what you've got. Really.
Okay.
This is really a political argument.
I think what Kenneth Baker and to a certain extent Fiona are doing are speaking of Shakespeare as if he has essential qualities that exist all the time and are open to view to those who are intelligent enough or tutored enough to see that. My point is that there is nothing essential in Shakespeare, that Shakespeare can be read in a variety of ways, and that we read Shakespeare in accordance with the political, social, economic pressures of the time in which we live.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
But you've just disagreed with it.
No,
You've just been arguing that Shakespeare is a mountain range of beauty and so on and so forth.
But the sun shines differently because, one range of critics will focus upon that particular part. The critics of the 18th century had a different approach to Shakespeare to the 19th century critics.
Not just
you have
different.
You have a different approach to Bradley and Granville Barker, the sort of critics that I read at school.
Yes. I should jolly well hope so. No, Shakespeare, for instance, in his own time, just after he died, a poet called John Dryden, as you well know, decided he would rewrite one of Shakespeare's plays, Antony and Cleopatra, and called it All for Love. Now, the attitude you're professing seems to me to suggest that that would be an act of blasphemy, and we should think that was an impossible thing to do, and anybody would dare to rewrite Shakespeare. Shakespeare's reputation has not always been what it is today. The reputation of him being the great bard, the centre of our culture, is something that started in the 19th century and runs parallel, I may say, with the development of an English nationalism whose other arms are military, political and economic.
Okay, what English nationalism is this, and what evidence do you say Shakespeare
Well, for instance, if you read the criticism of, say, Coleridge and Hazlitt, indeed Hazlitt as opposed to Coleridge, you'll see going on, Jonathan Bate has been mentioning this, going on a battle for the ownership of Shakespeare during the 19th century, which has serious political overtones.
But let's get into Shakespeare himself. Is Shakespeare
Well,
an
that's
English
exactly
nationalist?
my point, that you can't, there is no Shakespeare himself. There is no essential Shakespeare. There are only the plays and the ways in which we read and process those plays for various
Well, I don't
political
think Fiona
purposes.
and I are disagreeing with that. Of course, Shakespeare is capable of immense interpretation. That's the very strength, and the great imaginative genius of Shakespeare allows that. When you come on to the politics of Shakespeare, I think what angers so many modern sort of critics of the left wing is that you can't call him a Tory, you can't call him a socialist, you can't call him a communist. There are no isms. Shakespeare is not concerned with sort of bloodless philosophies. He is concerned actually with real people, engaging with real people. And I find this one of the most fascinating things about him. And when you think of Shakespeare writing at the end of Elizabeth's reign, he was very concerned about power in society and control in society and the cohesion of society. And that's not surprising when you consider that he was writing, 100 years after a bloody civil war. And he was very keen to point out the importance of a society holding together. And civil war is almost the greatest curse in all of Shakespeare's dramas.
But you do call him a conservative, don't you?
Oh, yes. I mean, if you take Shakespeare's politics at face value, what they offer us is government centrally vested in one single person. Now, I can see that Mr. Baker may think that's a perfectly acceptable form of government, but I don't. Neither do I accept that, for instance, ethnic minorities are to be treated as if they were subhuman. Which
Does
is
he
what
do that? Does he do that?
Of course he does. He treats Shylock as if he was less than human. There are very
But
serious...
does he?
doesn't.
But it does.
Well, the play offers that.
Fiona, Fiona.
Sorry, he doesn't at all. It's very interesting what you should say. I mean, I think that he's dealing with a world in which kingship existed, and therefore he uses kingship to explore human dilemmas, which is not mainly, it's about kings going, what do I do next, you know? And but that thing about whether he makes other groups less than human, including kind of women or Jews, is just not so, even though on the face value I agree that things like the population, say the Jewish population in the world, as shown with The Mirror Up to Nature by Shakespeare, would be 1 in a million, and with women it's about, 1 woman to every 8 men on the population. But when you see the plays, I mean, in terms of The Merchant of Venice, Shylock has the best speeches. He's given the most beautiful speeches.
The most sympathetic speeches.
But Satan has the best speeches in Milton's Paradise Lost.
That's because Milton's got a soft spot for sex.
Yes.
No, it isn't. It's because Milton, quite rightly, wanted to make evil attractive.
But your argument falls down, Professor, on the basis of your very first thing, because actually you said Hamlet doesn't exist, so Shylock doesn't exist.
Well, my point is
That
they
is
don't
what you said
exist
right at the beginning.
essentially. Hamlet doesn't exist in the sense that Hamlet gets up and has breakfast and has thoughts about his mother and so on. He doesn't exist in that sense. There's no essential existence. The play Hamlet is a text which we inherit and which we use to make to make our meanings, to make cultural meaning.
To make a happening at an event on stage, I would have thought ideally.
Well, I would say we use Shakespeare in this country and have done for 150 years as part of a way of making the world meaningful for ourselves.
By imposing meanings on it, I mean, rather than receiving, exploring it and
yes,
discovering
that's
what
right.
it says.
By using it to make meaning, yes.
I think that every time he speaks, Professor Hawkes proves the case that Fiona and I have been making. It's the richness and variety in the interpretation of the plays. And these are great, massive mountains. You can't disregard them. And they have dominated not only our culture, not only the Englishness of England, but also world culture. They've inspired other musicians, other poets, other actors. They've been translated very widely in the 19th century. Schlegel, as you know, translated Shakespeare into German.
I think your use of culture is what I'm objecting to. You're using it to mean high art, the work of musicians, poets and painters. There's another sense of culture which seems to me to be much more appropriate, the sense of the way people actually live every day, what ordinary people get up to in their lives and how they make those lives meaningful.
Can I ask about the ordinary people in Midsummer Night's Dream? Because it occurs to me that they are not patronised in any way by the nobles. Or if the nobles do patronise them, the nobles are making a mistake, because the working people in Midsummer Night's Dream are tremendously alive. Now, wasn't this an imaginative leap by Shakespeare, something quite new in the world, the way he treated the rude mechanicals in Midsummer Night's Dream? Would your reading of the play, would you say that they were being in any way repressed, looked down on, or so on by a higher order, or isn't it true that they are actually shown to be fully alive,
No, I don't think they are. I don't think what we're seeing are the ordinary people on the stage. That play is about, and this is the way in which we see the rude mechanicals, it's about playing. It's about playing roles. And we see the rude mechanicals largely through their rehearsal of a play. The play is about social identity. It's about how you fit into a community in which you have a role rather than a career, where your name is Baker because your father was a baker. Your name is Snug because your father was a joiner. Your name is Bottom because your father was a weaver, perhaps. But anyway, you inherit the name of your role in society, and that's what the play's about.
But then they just transcend that and become fully human. They do.
Well, what the play puts on the agenda, and what a lot of these plays put on the agenda, is what happens when the society can no longer sustain the roles that people have inherited. In other words, what happens when a rising bourgeoisie, the first stages of capitalism, decides to challenge some of these roles, particularly, of course, the role of the king. And you could follow that line through. That would give you access to the whole of Shakespeare.
If you talk about the challenge in the role of the king, kingship is very important. When you say that Shakespeare's approach is essentially conservative, Shakespeare certainly was in favour of authority and control in society, because he was living 100 years after the Civil War, and he wanted to stress that. And one of the fascinating things in Shakespeare is his attitude to kingship, as Fiona was saying. Why people want to become kings, why people want to retain kingship. The treachery, the honesty, the disloyalty. All those are fascinating aspects and a real exploration of people as they are living. And I think Clive James is right about, as it were, the mechanics in Midsummer Night's Dream. They are not representative of a class, they are people. I think they're living people. And Shakespeare puts very powerful and beautiful words into many of the people, as it were, the ordinary people. That's one of the extraordinary things about Shakespeare. Right at the end of Antony and Cleopatra, a man comes on carrying the basket with the worms in it. And the line is, clown enters carrying a basket. He has the most lovely words, and he has a little character all of his own. Now, he's not representative of a class. You're not interested in his career. You're interested in him as a person. And he has that lovely phrase, a woman is a dish for the gods if the devil dress her not.
Can I suggest, if
Mr. Baker really thinks,
if Mr. Baker really thinks that the rude mechanicals are real people, then it's time to send for the men in white coats.
No, because it makes more sense to say that than to say they're not real people.
Well, no, what you're saying, Clive, you're right. It appeals to common sense. Yeah. But one of the things we do on this programme, surely, is don't settle for common sense. Yeah. There's something much more complex about the way a play works. It is not to do with real.
Well, does it make any sense?
You're asking a question much the same as saying, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's around to hear it, does it make a sound? Of course the plays don't exist if we don't read them, or we don't. As soon as they're allowed alive, they come alive. Mm-hmm. And I think, to go back to your earlier point, I think, of course, you're right that somehow the sadness of the nature of drama often is that you have to have some fundamental belief that the ramifications of a happening to a prince or a king have more effect, obviously, on the rest of the population than the happenings to a member of the mechanicals. Equally, though, I would say that the effect of the national companies or any companies or touring companies doing Shakespeare has a wider effect on the population than the amount of people who have seen those productions. As Peter Brook says, in some way, theatre is fashion. And each time we redo those plays, we re-see them and we re-explore them. When you say Midsummer Night's Dream is about identity, of course it is. And each time it's a new journey into identity. Or that you say, Mr. Baker, that kingship is admired by Shakespeare because he was aware of what lack of kingship would mean, is also to say that he does not ignore the exploration of chaos and things like, as you like it, when you come out of the comedies, you don't come out remembering the order at the end, you come out remembering the kind of bit in the middle.
Yes.
Which was the more dangerous bit.
You say the characters are alive. Are the women characters in Shakespeare alive enough for you to satisfy? Yeah?
They're the bane of my life.
Why?
Very often because I suppose that's to do. I mean, I agree with Professor Hawkes about trying to. One has to constantly reassess. They don't exist in the sense that they are merely hieroglyphics on a page until we bring. What Shakespeare's managed to do is that in the equation of what makes a play, he has allowed one element to be missing, which is the person playing it. That's why they're forever plastic, and when we're all dead and in 200 years' time people are in spacesuits doing Shakespeare, they'll still be doing the same Shakespeare, and they'll still probably be discovering the same things about themselves. Now, who the people who are playing Catherine in The Taming of the Shrew will be then, I don't know.
Well, let me ask you about her, because you did go public when you were playing Catherine, which you played marvellously, but you did say Shakespeare hadn't given her quite enough to say. Now, this indicated two things. First of all, you thought she was alive, all right. Second, you didn't think she was alive enough. In other words, you wanted her to be a feminist or more, at least put up a fight.
Not at all. It's not really that. It's not that. There's certain questions you can't ask, like, is Shakespeare a feminist? But I think very often he writes women in relationship to men. They're in relationship to. Now, of course, for interest, really exploratory interest, people are only interesting when they experience the world as themselves rather than in relationship to somebody. And sometimes his interest seems to be kind of vulgarly in relation to the tamer and the taming of the shrew and not the shrew.
But that's only taming of the shrew, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the Portia's a great part, and so is Beatrice is a wonderful part.
And so is Cleopatra, but
and
so is Rosalind, and so, yeah.
So is Rosalind.
But aren't these feminist roles? I sort of thought, looking back on Shakespeare now, the first thing for any thoughtful woman to say is that that's where it began. This is the artist who put the whole question of what a woman's role is in relation to a man actually on stage, literally on stage.
Yes, because he dealt with politics and with sexual politics, but all he could do really was write about people, which is his genius, to write about them as themselves. Women have always been people,
Isn't that
popular.
confirming what I said earlier, that in fact the plays are looking very closely at people, the way people fit into society. When in Macbeth, when Lady Macbeth asks the gods to take away her sexuality, says that she doesn't want to be female, she wants to be male. And this condemns, of course, Macbeth to the role of a womanish role. Isn't this part of the same questioning that we saw in Midsummer Night's Dream? How do people play the roles that society imposes on them? Now, you say that whenever the plays are performed, this sends tremors throughout the society. I find that very difficult to believe. And there's an irony in us sitting here saying that now, when earlier this evening there was a programme on BBC One called Making Out, which is a programme about women in our society, which I think is one of the finest dramatic confrontations with this problem that I've ever seen. Far more interesting than Shakespeare.
If you really believe this, you throw your hand in.
No, I
You're a
don't.
professor of an English department with actual more students applying each year,
Yes.
and you sort of throw your hand in and say, really, don't bother with Shakespeare because more people watch EastEnders. Now, what I would say, and what people like Clive and Fiona and I are trying to do, is to make Shakespeare more interesting to a wider audience.
Yes.
And one of it has to start in the schools, because most people come to Shakespeare at schools, and many are turned off, as Clive said in his introduction. And so one can concentrate on actually making it more attractive at schools and the dramatic content of the plays. And that is how it is being taught more and more. Could I just comment on something that Fiona said about the femininity in Shakespeare's plays? Because I saw you in The Taming of the Shrew, and I thought it was a superb performance, if I may say so. And really superb. I'm just not being polite because you're sitting in the same studio. It was a great performance. And I think that does pose very difficult problems, that long last speech that you make, where it's a submission. I think it is difficult to play in this modern age. Shakespeare was writing of women in a different age, with a different social background. And what you have to go through in that play, you have to call the sun the moon the sun. Your rags you have to describe as beautiful robes, your robes as rags. And there is this great bully man. He doesn't actually hit you, but he and then you have to make that speech ending with, and I put my hand beneath your foot, and my lord. I once saw that played, and she put the foot in, and she tossed it like that. And the text doesn't bear that interpretation.
No.
But I thought you handled the whole approach of a modern woman playing Kate very well.
Well, I think the text, what any text does, and Shakespeare does it, which is the problem often of literary criticism in relation to it, is that when the characters don't speak, as a player, of course, you have to interpret the silence. Now, when we play in Stratford, we play for enormous audiences, some of which are many school children, some of which are forced to have the text in their hands while they watch the play. You've kind of killed it. They must see the event, and they must also interpret the silence of the characters on stage, which is always very interesting, what the other people are doing. And so in that way, I mean, somebody could say one thing and mean another, or say something and interpretatively kick them. Or you've also got built-in juxtapositions. You've got the most beautiful speech, that 7 Ages of Man, said by Jaques, who's a kind of a complete misanthrope. There's always these kind of tensions.
Have there been other playwrights in the last 4 centuries that have written such great roles for women? I suppose Ibsen, Chekhov?
Well, I think Ibsen, yes.
Well, there's the author of Making Out, which Kenneth Baker seems to want to link with, what was it, Coronation Street or EastEnders, but that is not the case. It is a major piece of contemporary drama. It's beautifully written, beautifully directed, and wonderfully acted by some wonderful women actors.
Criticising it.
Well, I think you are. You're saying it's not as good as Shakespeare. You're saying, why am I urging my students to watch Making Out?
In fact, it's unimaginable. It's unimaginable.
How can you say it isn't?
No, I think Auf Wiedersehen, Pet was an absolutely brilliant series, for example. But it's unimaginable except in a world which Shakespeare helped to create. It really, the rude mechanical.
Oh, that's totally
Well,
absurd.
the rude mechanicals in Midsummer Night's Dream are our biggest
The world we inhabit owes very little to Shakespeare. There was a sharp
This is
cut-off
philosophical nonsense.
at the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution cut me off from Stratford. To an extent, I was born in Birmingham, which is nearby. When I go to Stratford, I'm just as much a tourist as any American. I have no roots there in the
Could I
Midlands.
just say one thing? You may be in the program, that may have happened to you, and I think that's a great sadness if it did happen to you. But I always remember my father saying about his grandfather, my great-grandfather, and he was a rude mechanical, he was a carpenter, an ordinary artisan carpenter. And he learned Shakespeare by heart. I think he left school at 12. And he could remember whole speeches of Shakespeare. I remember my father saying this to me. And he was sitting in his chair and reading to the family and talking to the family. Now, he get tremendous pleasure from that. You know, he didn't study like you and I have studied. And there was someone born at the end of the 19th century who really loved it. And
You're
it
in
meant,
grave
that
danger.
meant to him a lot.
You're in grave danger of selling your own pass here, because if he had to leave school at the age of 12 in order to love Shakespeare...
Why don't they all? You mean, why don't everybody?
I saw it in your eyes when you were saying it. But none of this would matter at all if Shakespeare's language wasn't exceptional. Is it exceptional? This...
Shakespeare's language in the plays, you mean?
Yes, in the play.
I
In
don't
other words,
know.
I know that you argue that it's not really memorable or indeed intelligible outside the context of the plays, and shouldn't be quoted in.
I don't
So
see how
couldn't
you
go away,
can
but people do, don't they?
separate the language from the play, or indeed the processing of the play that I've been talking about. What you're referring to, you say people remember Shakespeare's language, is that the phrases from the plays have passed into common parlance, so that, like the lady who went to Stratford to see Hamlet and said it's full of quotations, it's part of the way we think. But that's really the point I'm making. Shakespeare is used to make us think in certain ways.
Yes, but
He's used to make us think there's a divinity that shapes our ends, rough hew them how we will. If you believe that, you'll believe anything.
Well, can I just come in on that? Is that it's just, I think in relation to Shakespeare's language, what is beautiful about it is that he wrote at a time when, for whatever quirky, lucky feeling of history, thought and feeling were the same thing for the Elizabethans. And they expressed their feeling brilliantly. And no age since then has done that. The 19th century repressed all feeling and wouldn't describe it, and the 20th century seemed to be kind of saying,
the Elizabethan
kill
period was
language.
pretty good at repression too, you know.
I'm not
cutting people's
denying
hands
that.
and
I'm
arms
just
off
saying that
on
in
their
terms
noses.
of their literature, they just did fuse it, and of his contemporaries, he seems to have done that better than the others. If you read Ben Jonson, you get masses of polemic. You read Shakespeare, and you just hear this fusion, so your mind is engaged at the same time as your heart is. And that seems to be the optimum, I would have thought.
It seems to me, if you go and listen to it, or go and watch another Elizabethan play or Jacobean play, and I sat through 5 hours of Tamburlaine once. Interesting play, great drama. Not very great poetry in it. All the Marlowe supporters will know right in and say that's rubbish. But there's a couple of lines that really is, it is passing brave to be a king and walking triumph through Persepolis. Now, that's about it.
That's it.
Whereas when you're watching Shakespeare and listening to Shakespeare in the theatre, there are moments when your heart is lifted because he did have a muse of fire that did ascend the brightest heaven.
That's him talking.
And that's him talking, not me.
Now, Mr. Baker, there are moments when your heart is lifted, I accept that. There are moments when the thousands of people who like Shakespeare's hearts are lifted, but we live in a society of 50 million people, most of whom, if they come into contact with Shakespeare at all, come into contact with him through their credit cards, or because his face appears on a banknote, or because they're forced to read him in school. Our society is not in touch with Shakespeare in the way that you would like it to be, and the way I suspect that Clive and Fiona would like it to be.
My society was. I was raised.
You're an Australian, of course.
I was raised in Australia in the 50s, when the emphasis in the schools, state schools, incidentally, all state schools, the emphasis was on knowledge induced into the skull, sometimes at the point of a cane. But one thing we were obliged to do was learn speeches of Shakespeare before we understood them, on the assumption that eventually we would understand. And I'm bound to say that in my case, I think it paid off. It was painful at the time. And I think that raises an important point about education. Should it only appeal? Should education be... Should it only be interpreted by those who are receiving it as relevant to their needs, or should they be faced with something they don't understand yet but might later?
Well, I believe in the latter. I think that children should be stretched, and it is difficult. Learning Shakespeare is difficult, and language is difficult. Language is an invention of man. Language isn't like nails and hair and teeth that just grows. You've got to work at it. You've got to work at it hard to really express yourself well. That's why I'm in favour of learning poetry.
Sounds a bit disciplinarian when you say
Well,
that.
no, that's why I'm in favour of children learning poetry by heart.
So am
I think it's really very important,
I
because if
agree
you can
with-
put into a child's mind that template of standards and examples of really beautiful language, which is with them for all their lives.
Fiona, did I see you bristling with this prospect of people being made to remember?
I do think it's a little bit disciplinarian, and I see what you mean about when you say that language is difficult, but I think, funnily enough, the abuse of language is what makes it difficult. That language, and particularly in plays or even in the sonnets of Shakespeare, the language itself is transitive, and actually, at best, he is so brilliant that I think children understand it and should understand it when it's good. And they should never have to learn by rote, as I did when you didn't quite understand, half the lines. That actually there's no reason why you shouldn't understand what it is you're learning.
I went
to learn the quality
I
of
went to a
mercy.
school in the
Learn it.
Bronx, a real sort of ghetto school, dreadful slum area. And I went into a class of 9 and 10-year-olds, and they were doing Macbeth. And the class was virtually all Hispanic and black children. And they were actually enjoying it. They weren't putting it on for me. They did the witches' scene, and they did the struggling and the fighting of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. And it meant something to them. Now, those kids, they haven't got books at home. They've never heard of Shakespeare back home. They're watching the sort of programmes you're saying everybody's watching. But that was elevating to them. It was wonderful.
Elevating.
Yes, it carries with them. They were
Did I see you
cheered up.
bristle when you tried?
They were cheered up by it. Yeah. I think that your prospect is a very dull and grey sort of thing. Could I just give
you
you an
should come
example?
to my lecture sometime. They're not dull.
No, I'm sure they're not boring. Could I just give you an example of how Shakespeare's taught in schools now? Because I think many kids are turned off Shakespeare in school. But this is a group in Cambridge at Experimental Theatre. And there were 2 actors who went in, there's lots of examples, into a class of 10 and 11-year-olds. And they did Macbeth. And they first explained the story, and then they had 15 Macbeths on that side and 15 Lady Macbeths on that side. And the actor said, "What hands are here?" The Macbeths stepped forward, holding up their hands in a poor fascination. "Ha, they pluck out mine eyes," and they do this. And then it goes on, "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? Arms are open, spread in imploring appeal. The Lady Macbeths back away in a mixture of surprise and contempt." And then they say, "The multitudinous seas in Carnadine." Now, those kids of 10 and 11 never heard of multitudinous seas in Carnadine. But it's the rolling language. The syllables are rolled, lengthy, sonorous. And those kids are enjoying it and enjoying an experience. Now, that will lead on to something. It will not lead into a cul-de-sac.
I read the piece that Kenneth Baker's quoting, and when I read it, I thought I'd never seen so much rubbish in all my life. And now he's read it out, that's reinforced it to me. But that is nothing to do with Shakespeare. It is simply, it's like finger painting. It's teaching them to be self-expressive, which is one of the major problems in our society.
But surely the point about Shakespeare is that 1 line or 2 lines have got a lot to do with Shakespeare, because that can start you off. I can remember the moment. I can remember it can start you off, for example, reading Shakespeare. I can remember the moment it happened, and Laurence Olivier was responsible. I saw the movie of Henry V, and he was doing the Crispin's Day speech, and he said, "And Crispin Crispian shall ne'er go by, from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered." And it was that final syllable that said, hey, it's not the way we talk now, it's the way they talked then. And it opened up the whole perspective of the past for me, and the hair on my neck bristled, and I was off.
Yeah.
And for the next few weeks, I was reciting that speech in the bath, inaccurately, but with terrific resonance.
But
now,
when-
the point about poetry is that is what poetry can do for you, and Shakespeare writes it. What makes him different from the other playwrights of his time was that he wasn't really of that time, or not just of that time, he was transcendental, he was a genius.
Does it make any difference, Clive, that film which you're talking about, which I was very impressed with too, nevertheless was part of a government programme in 1944 to prepare the country for the D-Day landings, to prepare people to face the fact that we had to land in northern France and defeat an effete and cruel enemy there, and that what
Who were
made
not the French, is it?
well, the French are the Germans in that context, obviously, and the film, and this is the other interesting, the film was sponsored by government money, Kenneth Baker, please note, and yet it was shot, irony of ironies, in Ireland. Now, doesn't that mixture of political
it's fascinating.
observations,
Are you saying that
does it add anything to your appreciation of the
But
film?
was the
Yes,
film
it
there
does.
to distract people, or rather that they were to make the
The
connections?
film
they were
was,
to make
they
connections.
were to make the film was part of a propaganda exercise. It was
Absolutely.
used as propaganda. Well, isn't
yes.
it still?
No, because the latest production of Henry V by Kenneth Branagh is actually set in the First World War. And once more into the breach, dear friends, the despairing, he interprets it as despairing speech. Once more into the breach, dear friends.
Not again,
So
yes.
all I'm saying to you, it was of course presented at that time, produced in that time. I remember it because I was actually studying Henry V's school cert at the time. And it was uplifting and ennobling, and it is seen as that. What I am saying, and you're making our point and Fiona's point all the time, that Shakespeare is capable of a tremendous interpretation at different times, at different stages. But you see, when you criticise
That's
these
exactly
actors
it.
for teaching Macbeth in this way, how would you teach Macbeth to children?
I wouldn't.
The social history of Scotland in the 12th and 13th centuries, or the social history of Shakespeare's time? Of course you don't. You have to capture their excitement, their imagination, their enthusiasm. It's waiting there. And these young people, whom you're so contemptuous about, in how they're going to learn Shakespeare, are going to end up as some of your students.
That's grossly unfair. I'm not contemptuous of them. I'm contemptuous of the person who's written and done that to them. It seems to me quite wrong to try to teach 12-year-olds Macbeth.
But
Macbeth is a very serious political...
People have a gorgeous time. They go for different reasons. Bob Crowley has this wonderful story about sitting in Stratford where Macbeth was being on. Ian McKellen was saying tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, and two ladies were sitting next to each other, one said to the other, that'll be Friday. You know, that's fine. It doesn't, I mean, that's fine.
Fine in what sense? What's
I mean,
it?
of course it's not fine. They weren't. They clearly had missed some. They missed the point. But they were having a time. They were having
their
an
dose of
experience
Shakespeare.
that they felt
Yes.
had something to do with them, though.
But you think
That'll be
you're
Friday.
saying
She felt
Shakespeare
connected
is
towards
good
it.
for you, like Guinness, or Shakespeare, you can get addicted to Shakespeare. That's what Clive was saying.
Shakespeare's good for you, like beauty's good for you, like mud isn't good for you, like, you know, I mean, without being a kind of a spiritual empiricist, love is real and excitement is real, and they can't be bought, and they don't come in packages at Lasky's. You just...
Why is
they're
Shakespeare
real.
good for you, and say Making Out, which was on earlier this evening on television, is not good for you?
I'm not
No,
saying
nobody
that.
said it wasn't good
Nobody's
for you. It's just
saying
not.
that.
I'm sure there's
Why
no
isn't
good-
it just as good
Because
for you?
Shakespeare was what is genius? It's universal, and one of the things about a universal experience like that is the banal response is correct. It's not the only response, but you're allowed to have a banal response as well as a sophisticated one.
But isn't it reasonable to say, I don't believe in genius, I don't believe in universal human nature?
No,
I
because you
believe...
have to replace it with another word. What will you call supreme talent if you don't call it genius?
Well, I wouldn't call it genius, because genius suggests that there are universal characteristics in us which prise us free of
In Shakespeare, not
the
us.
context in which we live, and I don't believe
Genius
that.
is a recognition by millions of people over 4 centuries that this man said something that was very special in a way that was very special. And if you were trying to redefine it and say that isn't genius, he was just another writer of the time, another Johnson, another Marlowe, another Beaumont, another Fletcher, I would suggest you're slightly out of tune with the rhythm of humanity.
People
And
thought
the-
Hitler
and the
was a
rhythm.
genius at the time.
No, that's a silly argument.
No, it isn't. If
got
you
it.
go on
Genius
what
is organising.
people think, the way people respond...
But may I say why I think he would be a genius rather than just that I think he's a genius, which is that it isn't just what he said, as Mr. Baker says, it's not just what he said or the way in which he said it, but his ability to make the characters say it in a specific way in relationship to themselves, in relation to their political situation. So if I can just take 2 speeches. One is, Celia says to Rosalind at the beginning of As You Like It, by way of saying she loves her, she says, herein I see thou lovest me not with the full weight that I love thee, headline of the speech. Then she says, with all these commas, which gives a blueprint of her mind, she goes, if my uncle, thy banished father, had banished thy uncle, the Duke my father, so thou hadst been still with me, I could have taught my love to take thy father for mine. A very complicated way of speaking, and not your average girl around town. She goes, bum, 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 conclude. It's also a very delicate way of saying to somebody you love them. Rosalind, her friend, on the other hand, when she speaks, says sentences like this. No, Orlando, men are April when they woo, December when they wed, maids are May when it is May, but the sky changes when they are wives. They talk completely differently, and yet they're friends. Now, the possibilities of that, in terms of scenes, and in terms of the pulse of who we are as humans, that's what I mean about in
Can I
20
ask
years'
you a
time when we're
question, Fiona?
dead.
What do you think that scene's about?
Well, I'm quoting 2 different scenes there.
Well, what do you think's going on in that play between Rosalind and
And
other
Celia,
people? Yeah.
and Rosalind and other people.
Yeah.
Well, there's a few different things. I mean, there's 2 very serious things, which is that Rosalind has been, like a lot of women in Shakespeare, and indeed Celia, has no mother and is absolutely in a state of crisis, isolated, in this left behind in a court. I mean, that's a situation. Shakespeare plucks those 2 out and puts them into the Forest of Arden. Whatever that is, the Forest of Arden is, whatever we want it to be, which is where he frees us, really. He describes it's a gorgeous forest with lions and tigers, but also with a winter and also with a spring and a summer and a pond. I mean, So that's where you're into another he plucks them out and puts them in another territory. And then sits in this play, doesn't move it forward, unlike the history plays with kind of thunderous battle statements, but just sits, makes scenes where people just sit and talk. And then you've got to find out what they're about, and they're about chaos.
But suppose I said to you the play is about the role that women have in society. Would you think that was wrong?
No, it would only be one tiny part of what the play is about.
I wonder if Shakespeare would think in terms of the word role. I think one of the things
if he's interested in drama, of course he'd think in terms of the word role. It's an available metaphor for
He put them into a Citibank, if that's the case.
Questioning the available metaphors and making them better was one of the things he did. But one of the things he does with Rosalind is he creates an intelligence. This is an intelligent woman. Right? This is something almost unheard of before, certainly in literature. And it's a creation that poses every possible problem about the way women are to behave towards men and men towards women. And Rosalind, I think, like Beatrice, is just one of the superior women in Shakespeare. Is she not? Don't you feel that way when you play her?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm afraid this is a bit of a bee in my bonnet, is that I don't think there have ever not been intelligent women. And the fact that they're not being written about...
No, I didn't mean that. Of course there were. But he saw that and wrote them down.
But this thing about women being ahead of their time, I don't think they were ever ahead of their time. I think there were women absolutely in their time. And that's the point about them, is that far from... I mean, in every play, there's a woman ahead of her time. You know, I'm always playing women ahead of their time. I've played them in every age. They're just not ahead of their time.
But Shakespeare did say that he said that he knew they'd always been there. He put them on the stage. He put them into literature.
He freed them. I mean, in terms of Rosalind, he frees a woman from her sex and sexuality in order to talk about love, to explore love.
What about when the women dress up as men?
What about it? They always do it for... I mean, he may have done it for some pragmatic reason, but that's almost irrelevant.
For one thing, they're already men dressed as women, aren't they?
Exactly. Don't you think that transvestism in Shakespeare is a way of questioning all kinds of interesting presuppositions about roles?
Rosalind spends half her time dressed as a man.
Exactly.
But she's already a boy dressed as a woman.
I realise that.
Well, that makes it easy, doesn't it?
I realise that. Well, no, it means that transvestism is part and parcel of the whole business of drama. And transvestism, surely, is one of those questionings of gender roles.
Oh yes, without a doubt.
That we still think of it as.
And we don't explore on teleplays, on Sunday nights, on television plays, you know, on the BBC or whatever. We don't see it.
When it comes to the roles of women, I think that the women characters that Shakespeare creates are infinitely more real than the other characters created in contemporary plays. If you take Johnson's, for example, Bartholomew Fair, now that is a sort of social description of various people and various categories in society. And Shakespeare doesn't do that quite in that sort of way. But they're not as real people, not so real, in my view, what real people are, as Rosalind and Kate and Cleopatra. I think that that's how they have been seen. And I think he does create these characters. You began by saying Hamlet doesn't exist. These people, in my view, do exist because Shakespeare has created them. And he is capable of putting into them, their minds, totally different ideas. For example, there's not a consistent view in Shakespeare about the role of fate. And there's the famous, the fault, dear Brutus, lies not in the stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings, i.e. there's not a destiny which shapes our ends. But on the other hand, as flies to wanton boys, so we are to the gods, they kill us for their sport. And that is, again, the creative, huge imaginative genius of Shakespeare. Yeah. And he can put into the mouths of certain characters one set of ideas, and in the mouths of another character another set of ideas. And the characters almost create their ideas and live themselves.
And in relationship to who's saying them. I mean, your Hamlet will be different to Clive's Hamlet, and, you know, that'll also colour both of you.
What do you make, then, of the argument which would say all these great ideas that you're pointing to are, in fact, commonplaces of that culture? They're commonplace of Christian thinking. They're not great original ideas at all.
Is there such a thing as a great idea? There's only the working out of it. I mean, this was Shaw's great point about Shakespeare. He said he found he was contemptible of Shakespeare's mind measured against his own, but he missed the point, and I think he rather knew he missed the point. It wasn't a question of the mind; it was the question of what the mind was expressing and the ramifications of that.
I'm certainly not against teaching Shakespeare. It's the way you teach it and how you do, what you do with it. And what I'm certainly not prepared to do is to teach people simply to sit in front of the plays and gawp admiringly at them. Yes. It's much more interesting to say to them, why don't we look and see how this society, say in the 19th century, or this society around the time of the First World War, was using Hamlet, was using Henry V as part of its way of making the world meaningful to itself.
I don't object to that.
Now that is teaching Shakespeare, but it's not admiring him.
I think that is one way. But there are so many ways to go up the mountains.
Okay, it seems to me this question is still open, and every other question about Shakespeare is still open, except the fact that he was very, very good. But time has advanced, and I've always wanted to say this, but look, where the dawn in russet mantle cloud walks o'er the dew of yon high eastward hill, break we our watch up. Terence Hawkes, Kenneth Baker, Fiona Shaw, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you.